Hello and welcome to a special general election edition of Don't Shout at the Telly with me, Fraser Myers. Joining us on the sofa today is Brendan O'Neill, editor of Spiked. So Brendan, would you like to give us your thoughts on this election?
Yes, I think it's a really, really weird election because on the one hand I think it is the most exciting and important election of my lifetime, and that's a fairly long time. But everyone involved in it, all the parties, all the media commentators, all the party leaders seem really hell-bent on making it as boring as possible. So we have this really extraordinary contradiction between an election which raises incredibly important and historic questions about democracy and the future and who rules Britain, whether it's people in Brussels or people in Britain, questions about popular sovereignty, about class and power and geography, all these things that have been really raised to the surface by the Brexit vote in particular last June. Those should be infusing this election, and they kind of are in a very unspoken way. But everyone involved in the election is trying their best to bring it back to the boring territory of technocratic politics, small fry politics. Every time a party leader does an interview, all that they are asked is this costed? As if it was like accountancy rather than politics. So there's this incredibly strange contradiction. Everyone knows that politics for the next 5 years will be entirely about how do we leave the European Union? Why are we leaving the European Union? How can we improve democracy once we've left the European Union? Everyone knows those will be the defining questions of politics for the next 5 years. But they are really keen to keep dragging the whole election debate back to the safer, more boring territory of slightly technocratic politics. How should society be managed? We need to pull this election back to the territory of Brexit and the questions that were raised by Brexit, which I think are brilliant, wonderful, historically unresolved issues about sovereignty and democracy and power.
So I suppose I struggle with this idea that Brexit is the only thing that matters in this general election. I am a loud and proud Brexiteer, but I do struggle with the idea that it's the only thing that we should be thinking of when we go to the ballot box, particularly because, on paper I should be voting for Theresa May because she's going to implement a hard Brexit, and that is essentially what I want and I think is right because it's a democratic thing to do. But her party and her manifesto and her as a politician also represents so much that concerns me and that I disagree with.
I hear your argument about Brexit, but I would also say that to not pay any attention to the ideas of social inequality, to the ideas of housing, to the ideas of immigration, to the ideas that frankly we don't face as a society very often. And this election is a very unique opportunity for us to do so in a lot of ways. So I don't see the reason why we should negate those sorts of opportunities for discussion. And frankly, we already know the outcome of Brexit.
I think the issues of sovereignty raised by Brexit are interesting and they're ideologically very engaging. But a lot of the reasons why people voted for Brexit weren't to do with that. They were to do with the NHS and they were to do with housing, which are exactly the issues that you say are the boring issues at play here.
I would say that obviously the Brexit result obviously came through and everyone's accepted it now. I think the question is more that what is the deal? So what are we going to get? Are we going to get a no deal or are we going to get a soft or a hard Brexit?
I really, really disagree with the idea that Brexit is a done deal. I mean, just because 17.5 million people voted for it, which is the largest number of people who've ever voted for anything in British history, doesn't mean it's going to happen because we are surrounded by what I call the forces of darkness, which are these incredibly anti-democratic forces who have got a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of influence and who have literally devoted their lives at the moment to making sure Brexit doesn't happen. There are a lot of people out there who would rather that we didn't have a say in politics. There are people like Gina Miller, the very rich businesswoman who is funding a campaign to get anti-Brexit candidates into Parliament. There's Tony Blair, the former Prime Minister slash murderer of 100,000 people who is also trying to undermine Brexit. There are a lot of influential people who are trying to do it in. And I think even Theresa May, who poses very much as pro-Brexit, I'm not convinced by her either, because she's obviously, as we know, a Remainer at heart. She was anti-Brexit. She campaigned against Brexit. And my concern is that once she goes into the negotiations with the EU, she will water down Brexit. So I think Brexit is actually incredibly fragile. And protecting Brexit really means protecting democracy and the ideal of democracy and the ideal that ordinary people should have the final say in what happens to the nation that they live in. The second thing I would say is that in terms of other issues, the thing about Brexit is that if we have Brexit, if Brexit happens, if we have this rupture with the European Union so that we have more democratic say-so in Britain itself, and so that the people who voted for Brexit feel democratically emboldened and feel that their voice actually matters, which they've probably never felt before in their lives, then all those issues come to life in a completely new way. The great thing about Brexit is that it brings politics back to the populace itself, away from those kind of Brussels suits and experts who had been making quite a few decisions on our behalf. So all those issues that we are all concerned about, which is how are we going to build 1 million new homes, how are we going to make the NHS a decent health service rather than one that kind of hectors you as you walk in the door and treats you like a piece of muck. All those questions that we are all very interested in come to life in a really new way as a result of Brexit. That's why I would elevate Brexit above all the issues, because Brexit is the means through which those issues become more democratic and more real, and through which we can have a greater say and a greater impact on them. That's why in this election, I think it's really important to find the candidate in your local area who is most pro-Brexit and vote for him or her. That's what I would say about this election in particular.
If, like me, you live in a constituency where Harriet Harman's your MP, Conservative candidate is a Remainer and is still a staunch Remainer, then can not voting or spoiling your ballot paper be a political action in and of itself?
I do feel like Brexit has emboldened people to engage with politics in a way that perhaps they hadn't before, and it does bring politics back within the remit of the populace. But because Brexit has been an energising force of such, I don't think the focus needs to be on Brexit so much, particularly as we have candidates who have completely radically different policies and who stand for very different values, which are very strongly differentiated, which I think is something that we didn't get in the previous elections.
I agree with your point about how Brexit's going to have a knock-on effect, but I just can't live with increasing the privatisation of the NHS, less housing, tuition fees. I just can't live with a Tory landslide.
It's important, I think, that we remind ourselves every now and then how radical Brexit was. Brexit was the first time in the history of our getting the franchise that people used their vote not simply to reject a particular party, but to reject the entire nature of politics. That has never happened before, not since working class men got the vote, not since women got the vote. There's never been a referendum or an election in Britain where we've used our vote not simply to say we're sick of Labour, we're sick of the Liberals, we're sick of Tories or whatever, but we reject the entire makeup of British politics, which is what Britain and the EU moulded together over the past 30 or 40 years. That's how British politics was done. So we need to, I think, always remember how radical that was. And I think we should always challenge the suggestion that it was a conservative vote, or it was backward, or it was nationalistic, or it was Little England. In my mind, Brexit was an incredibly radical vote. The first time in history that British voters have used their vote to reject the establishment itself. Firstly, that's why it casts its shadow over everything in politics, because it was so radical, because it was so daring, because it was so unusual. So it completely rattled the establishment in a way that no other vote has in history. That's also why they don't want to talk about it, because it's too scary for them. The first thing I would say about issues in relation to the election is that I don't agree that there is a huge difference between Labour and the Tories. So I don't agree with this suggestion that this is an election at which there is a real radical binary choice between one party, Corbyn's party, which is, I don't know, pro-society or whatever they pose as, and the other party, which is privatisation and evil Thatcherism and so on. I don't think it's like that at all. I think the parties are actually very similar, and their disagreements tend to be over how far you should go on such an issue and how far you should pull back on another issue. in the round, generally speaking, they pretty much agree on most issues, on most fundamental issues. So I would be keen to hear anyone who would disagree with that and suggest that there is a radical difference between Corbyn and May. I don't see it myself, except on the issue of Brexit. Theresa May has recognised that Brexit is a powerful force, and Jeremy Corbyn is scared of Brexit. And he's scared of Brexit because he knows that if he supports it, he will lose the Blairite bourgeois wing of the Labour Party. So he's torn between wanting to keep happy this middle-class bourgeois wing of Labour, knowing that if he keeps them happy, he'll annoy the working-class section of Labour, many of whom voted for Brexit. So he's in this real bind, and I do feel sympathy for him, I have to say. And then in relation to spoiling the ballot or refusing to vote for anyone because you live in an area where the MP is probably going to get back in, I think even in those areas, it's worth using your vote to say, I love Brexit. Because if you live in an area where, say, Harriet Harman is going to win, everyone's pretty sure of that, even if she loses a certain amount of votes or the other people come up a bit, it still sends a really important message. The problem with London, I love London, but there's a real problem with London, which is full of idiots who all want the EU and want to stay in the EU, apart from places like Dagenham and bits of Essex and some of the outskirts of London. I love those places so much. But London itself is very pro-Remain. That's a real problem. However, even if you live in a London constituency, which is very pro-Remain, and you're surrounded by these idiots, I think you should still use your vote for the person in your area who's most pro-Brexit, even if they haven't got hope in hell of winning, because it still sends a message to those MPs that they should be on the back foot, they should feel defensive and they should feel insecure. And I want those MPs who are anti-Brexit to feel incredibly insecure.
So it sounds like you're quite unsure as to which candidate would most support Brexit. So if you don't mind me asking, who would you vote for and why?
London voted for Remain and a lot of Scotland voted for Remain, and so did Northern Ireland. So surely Tim Farron is still pandering to a majority that are on possibly the far reaches of the UK, who won't be listened to by a lot of the London politicians who want to focus solely on Brexit and not so much what's going to happen in those areas.
I can't vote in the general election because I'm an EU citizen, but which is a shame because I would actually vote probably for the Tories for the reason that Theresa May in this case is the only candidate that is committed to deliver Brexit. But what I find really interesting is that for someone like me that probably wouldn't consider voting the Tories in the past, now I'm in a position where I have to make that consideration. And given that the Tories, a pro-status quo party, a party that defends the ruling elites, right? And now they're in a position where they're actually leading Brexit, quite a radical anti-establishment revolt. So it's quite an interesting position. At the same time, in relation to the points that were raised earlier about is Brexit a done deal or not, I disagree completely, because the reason I disagree is because you just have to look at the way in which the young people have been weaponised in the recent elections. And actually, even since Brexit, there's been a sort of like turning the old against the young in a very horrendous way. There was even talk about removing the right to vote for anyone over 65. And even now, during the general election, you have all sorts of campaigns trying to sway young people to go to the ballot box by bribing them with trips to Fort Park and ice creams like the NUS. And I find that not just patronising as a young person, but also it's not about really engaging young people. It's not about trying to get them to participate in politics. It's really to say, we want to stop Brexit at any costs. So let's get all the young people, because they're seen as more liberal and more open-minded, whereas they're all the bigots that voted for Brexit. So let's try and fight, against all that. And I find that appalling, I have to say.
There's this hysteria you're talking about Brexit not being a done deal. I don't see that, because I don't see how the UK can go against a democratically decided referendum. The implications of that, given the fact that the UK pushed this democracy and they use it to invade other countries, the implications of them going against the referendum, I just don't think it's something that would ever happen. What happens when you vote for Theresa May because she's pro-leave, but you don't agree with Tories' manifesto? But what happens is that we then don't have the EU as a body to hold the government accountable. So then all the power is with the Tories.
Can I just jump in? In relation to whether the referendum and democracy is ignored, it's a very rare thing for a referendum in relation to the EU to actually be listened to, because actually the trend is the opposite. When referendums have been held in Greece, in Ireland, in France, the Netherlands, and they don't go the EU's way, they're either asked to simply vote again until they get the right answer, or they're just ignored. We're very lucky that, you know, people don't talk explicitly about a second in-out referendum. The Lib Dems are couching their second referendum in terms of let's vote on the deal, but really we know their intention is to reverse Brexit.
I do agree that Brexit is very fragile, especially since 48% of the country voted for Remain. However, I do think by pushing the agenda that Brexit has to be the be-all and end-all of our decision, I think it's a very wrong thing to do, especially since, as discussed before, there are many, many issues that are more important in my opinion, especially in terms of social inequality and the rise in housing prices in London, which has affected me. I also think that by painting Remainers as this middle-class society is very wrong, because a lot of people voted Remain for many reasons. I wouldn't say I'm from a middle-class background, but I voted Remain because I thought, for me, as someone who used to be an immigrant, it's more beneficial for me in terms of my long-term career.
Really what the Brexit vote for me demonstrated was the diversity of British people's values and British people's points of view. So fundamentally I disagree with separating the Brexit vote into these binaries of rich versus poor, old versus young, because fundamentally it's a lot more complicated than that.
The vote for Brexit was very diverse, there's no question about that, including people who normally do not vote. And that, I think, for my mind, was the most important thing about Brexit. People who don't engage in politics because they feel, quite rightly in my view, that politics is no longer for them, got out and voted. So the turnout in places like Stoke, which is a very working class area and very pro-Brexit, and other parts of the north and parts of Wales, the turnout went up enormously because people took the referendum incredibly seriously. So you're absolutely right, it's very diverse. It wasn't a working class revolt as such, but within Brexit there was a very strong working class element. And I think a lot of the anti-Brexit sentiment takes the form of an anti-working class sentiment. These stupid people don't know what they're doing. Essex man, Welsh miners, so ungrateful. You know, these people in Wales should be so grateful for the EU because it built them a bridge once in 1992 or something. So there's all that narrative going on, which I find deeply patronising and snobbish. But you're right, it's a diverse vote. But just following on from that, I would say in response to your question and your question as well, I don't buy into the idea that there is this 48%. I just think it's a myth. And in fact, the percentage of people who want to stop Brexit from happening is not 48%, it's more like 21 or 22%. So most of the 48% who voted Remain are thoroughly decent people, are probably members of your families and your friends' networks and people you know, who now accept that they lost, and because we live in a democracy, the people who won should have their say. It's far more of a small elite who is really making the bid-in to try and thwart Brexit or weaken Brexit or turn Brexit into soft Brexit, this completely nonsense term that they've invented. So I don't believe that the 48% is a real force at all. It was on the day itself, on the 23rd of June, straight afterwards it stopped, because most of those people are Democrats and they respect the people who voted for Brexit. I completely agree with Fraser. Pretty much every time the European people have been asked to express their opinion on the EU, they've said, we don't like it, bugger it, get rid of it. The French and the Dutch in 2005 were asked to vote on the EU constitution and they rejected it. They were ignored and the EU constitution was passed anyway as the Lisbon Treaty. The Irish were asked to vote on the Lisbon Treaty and they rejected it. They were put under extreme pressure and basic economic blackmail, forced to vote again, and in the second vote they accepted it with a tiny, tiny turnout. Again and again, when European peoples have voted on the EU, they've said they don't want it, and they've been given it anyway. So when you have that precedent, you really recognise how fragile Brexit is. And this would be the first time that a vote against the EU was respected, and that's why we really need to make sure that that happens. In terms of who I'm voting for, I'm still slightly undecided, but I'm erring towards the Tories. I've never voted Tory in my life, not because I think they're worse than Labour. I think they're equally as bad as each other, in my view. I'm of a generation, the first time I could vote was in the mid-90s when Labour was preparing for power, was about to invade pretty much every country in the Middle East, killed hundreds of thousands of people, destroyed every civil liberty that Britain has ever enjoyed pretty much, turned the working classes into these objects that they needed to have their health improved and their lives policed and their parenting skills monitored. It was the most obnoxious political party of my lifetime. So I've never understood this idea that it's somehow worse to vote for the Tories than it is to vote for Labour. I've never, ever understood that. So I'm not saying I'm voting Tory and isn't that shocking. I'm just saying I probably will vote Tory. I'm erring towards that for two reasons. Because in their manifesto, they say Brexit means Brexit and we will leave the European Union, the single market and the customs union. And I think that's what Brexit means. And secondly, because they say that they will not enforce Section 40 of the Crime and Courts Act, which would have forced every single newspaper and magazine in Britain to sign up to a government-approved regulation of their content. And to my mind, democracy and press freedom are probably the two most important issues in political life. And the Tories, at this moment, are better on those two issues than any other party. They're worse on lots of other things.
One of the most amazing things about Brexit that Brexit has provided to us as a society is the opportunity to engage with politics, is the opportunity for us to start to discuss, the opportunity for us to enter the public sphere and frankly fight for what we believe in. I didn't vote for a Brexit that completely negates any relationship with the EU. I didn't vote for a Brexit that sends a political party in with the intention of not negotiating terms properly. So I do believe that the Labour Party, I do believe that the left, as scattershot as it is in a position to incorporate the views of many people and bring it to the table.
I disagree. What is good about this election is that it gives us an opportunity to finally, really make it clear that there can be no backsliding, there can be no watering down the terms of Brexit, 1 foot in, 1 foot out. For me, the Tories are the best on that. I absolutely agree with everyone else who says I despise the Tories. I hate everything they stand for. I hate pretty much, every policy they come up with. I'm very much with the audience on the debate the other night who booed Theresa May every time she talked about something, on her manifesto, but then cheered her every time she talked about Brexit. I'm very much with those people.
Brexit came about as a career move. It wasn't a move that was considering the best will of the people, and it was one that was carried out with David Cameron, thinking that Brexit wasn't going to go ahead with him actually campaigning against it. Because of that, to focus on Brexit too much, I think, in this election is maybe wrong in the sense that it then kind of paints the Tories again as figurehead of the working class people, when really their politics, the 5 more years of austerity, killing the NHS, cutting disabled allowances, and I feel that to focus on Brexit and to detract from how harmful their policies really will be towards those who are living in poverty, who are living around the poverty line, is slightly misleading.
I just think it's quite a dangerous game to play with painting every represented MP who voted against Brexit originally as a member of this elite who doesn't care or understand about democracy.
I think this push for a hard Brexit it's not the best decision, especially since 60% of our trading is with Europe. I definitely think a lot of consideration needs to be given in terms of what is our economy going to be like in the future. What is our economy going to be like in a Brexit world?
I voted Remain, but since obviously the whole process has gone through, now I think that the process of Brexit should continue and it should just go through. But my issue is not about the result anymore, it's about what we get from it, the deal. That's my issue. I also want to ask you about your definition of working class, because I live in this constituency, which is Hackney, and it's considered quite a poverty working class area, but they had the highest Remain vote, I think, in the entire country. So how do you say about that?
If you've never voted for Tories before, I assume that means you don't share many of their values. But then aren't you worried about the deal we're going to get here in Britain for ourselves if the Tories gain power?
The problem with the hard and soft Brexit idea is the fact that, in my opinion, we don't have any power in the negotiations. We are going up against an organisation which is backed by a vast majority of Europe. That's a lot of power going against the UK government. And I feel that when it comes to negotiating, we won't be able to ask for anything to do with the single market, to do with the justice system, to do with any of the economics. We won't have any power in it because we're the ones who want to leave.
I really genuinely don't understand how that contrast works for you in voting for her, but then you hate all her policies, but you're essentially giving her more power.
Well, I don't hate the Tories. I'm not one of those people who thinks the Tories are evil or, goes on about Thatcher all the time or anything like that. I think they are just another party, really. They're not that different to Labour, in my view. In fact, if anything, I hate Labour more, simply because I think they've been more destructive to life, liberty and economic choice than the Tories have in my lifetime. So I don't hate the Tories, but the thing is, what's the difference between Theresa May and Juncker in the European Commission or any of the other suits in Brussels? There's one difference. We have control over her. We can vote her out. We have no control over them. This is the fundamental difference, and it's a massively fundamental difference. It is the defining difference in political life. It's like the old saying, a bad elected politician is better than a good king. Because the good king might give you everything you want and be nice to you and tap you on the head, but you have no control over him. You can't get rid of him because he's the king. Whereas the politician might be evil and horrible and nasty and treat you like muck, but you can get rid of them. This is the difference. This is the defining difference of the democratic era. That is why I'm opposed to the European Union. The European Union is a fundamentally anti-democratic institution. It is designed to water down national and popular sovereignty. That's what it exists to do. That's why I'm opposed to it. On top of that, it's also incredibly neoliberal and will always elevate the interests of its own central bank over, for example, the livelihoods of the Greek working classes. So I don't understand for the life of me why any left-wing person supports the European Union. It's an incredibly neoliberal institution. It's also racist. It has an explicitly racist immigration policy where it allows freedom of movement for Europeans who are predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly white, and it bans freedom of movement for blacks from Africa and from people from Asia who drown at sea trying to get to Europe because Fortress Europe forbids entry to them. I have no understanding why anyone who describes themselves as left-wing would vote for such a pro-capitalist, racist institution. It bamboozles me. It really does. I have literally sleepless nights trying to work out how this can be. So those are the reasons I'm opposed to the EU. Theresa May is preferable to the EU for all her bad policies because I, as one tiny democratic citizen in this nation of millions, have some control over her and whether she gets to rule us or not. The sooner we get Brexit, then the sooner we can start asking questions of whether these parties should exist anymore. In my view, they shouldn't. They don't do much good, really. We need a new form of politics. The final thing I would say in relation to the working classes and who represents them, I think you're absolutely right. The Tories' claim to represent the working classes is just quite shallow and transparent and doesn't reflect reality at all. But the Labour Party doesn't represent the working classes either. And in fact, they are losing working class support. And they have been for 50 years. You have this massive, if slightly quiet, revolt of a significant section of society against the party that claims to represent them, against the establishment that claims to represent them. The problem is that they have no outlet. Who will speak for the working classes? Who will connect with them? Who will represent them? That's one of the questions raised by Brexit. The reason Brexit is so important is because it completely and utterly turns British politics on its head. That's not something we should be afraid of. That's something we should welcome, celebrate and stir up.
That's a fantastic note to end on. I'd just like to thank Brendan O'Neill, our special guest, and all our volunteers. If you'd like to take part in the next edition of Don't Shout at the Telly, please email us and hit the subscribe button on YouTube.